I'll give you a second to quiet down. I love all the excitement and the energy in the room. This is great. My name is Jared Burkholder. I'm chair of the Department of History and Political Science. Wow. Yeah, I usually don't get that, so I don't really know how to respond to that. I'm used to the 3 students in our department, maybe giving me some love, but thanks for the applause there. I'm not used to that. Yeah. I'll take it, yeah. All right. Well, thanks for quieting down and giving us your attention today in chapel. And I'm glad Emerson could finally make it up here in the front row too. And I think you can tell from our format, the way things are set up, that we're running another roundtable today. I mean, these are great, right? Did you enjoy the last one? Yeah, I did. All right, I'm not sure why you're chuckling, but anyway, I am really appreciative of our chaplain, our dean of the chapel, and for the way Brent has been putting these roundtables together. I don't know if you realize it or not, but we are really lucky to have a dean of the chapel who creates these kinds of spaces and venues that we can dialogue about interesting topics, about sometimes debatable topics and controversial topics. In many ways, I feel like the folks on the student affairs side of campus are really leading the way in many of these conversations, and some of us faculty members are just trying to catch up. So I really hope that you appreciate the formatting that Brent has done for us in creating these roundtables. So this is the second one today. And our goal really is to take a topic, model civility. We don't all have to think the same. And model the way that we can have conversations and discussions around a relevant and current topic. Now, it just so happens that the roundtable today also coincides with Constitution Day, which is actually a federal holiday. You may or may not have been aware of that. And lots of colleges and universities around the country do stuff for Constitution Day. And here at Grace, the Department of History and Political Science puts together a chapel service with, rarely do we talk about the Constitution, but it's just an excuse to bring up issues of citizenship, sometimes politics, things of this nature, the public sphere, and think about how they bump into and intersect with Christian faith. So this is our Constitution Day chapel as well today. The roundtable discussion, and I'm going to try to speed up here to get our panelists up here. The topic is immigration. Obviously, this has been a topic the last several years that we may have sort of been attuned to. But it's a topic, of course, that has been around for centuries as it relates to U.S. history and our relationship with other nations, some of which are far away and some of which are just next door. And of course, we have the election coming up in 2020, and we'll have to wait and see how the immigration issue plays out in the narrative and in the campaign as well. It's also a personal issue for some, and we want to recognize that. We want to be realistic about that. And so be sensitive to that as we have conversations with each other. And even if this is a personal issue for you and it's your experience is such that this topic is a bit overwhelming for you, email Brent and just let him know that, hey, this is too personal, I'm going to step out. So we rarely talk about politics explicitly in chapel, but remember our Christian faith should be integrated, at least to some degree, in all aspects of life, even if it merely informs the sorts of questions that we consider, right? We're not saying we're getting political because we have a certain destination in mind for you or a certain view that you have to adopt simply because this is a Christian institution. But sometimes our faith merely provides the structure for what we should be thinking about and wrestling with and the questions that we should be asking. All right, so that's where we're headed today. As in the past, we've got three panelists that are going to provide leadership for our conversation, and they're going to come up as I introduce them. So I'm going to bring up Kirstin Mead first. Some of you know Kirstin, right? Yes. Our former student body president, she was, in fact, a political science major. So our department can take all the credit for her. And she has since graduated and has gone on and is doing awesome graduate studies, awesome graduate work at the University of Ohio. And I'm told I'm supposed to say, OH. It worked. Yes, just like you said it would. All right. So Kirstin's going to be in our panel as well. Next, Dr. Michael Bednarczuk. Come on up, Dr. Bednarczuk. Dr. Bednarczuk is an instructor of political science here at Grace. He's relatively new to our community, and I would love for you to take some political science, government courses, foreign policy, whatever they might be that sparked your interest with Dr. Bednarczuk somewhere in the future. He earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which is kind of the main campus up there, right? Yeah. And has taught at some other places like Ohio University, which I'm told is different from where Kirstin is residing right now, yeah. And then also Belhaven University as well. And he's got some publications and doing all the things that good academics are supposed to be doing. And then thirdly, we have Felipe Hinojosa, Dr. Felipe Hinojosa. And Dr. Hinojosa teaches at Texas A&M University. He's also very accomplished. He's got a book out on Mennonite Latinos and their experiences. He's well published. He teaches lots of course. He's been redesigning curriculum at Texas A&M. And he grew up in Brownsville, Texas. This is one of the southernmost border towns. And has been one of the hot spots in the immigration issue, and is actually, I Googled this just to make sure, but it's actually, so distance-wise, if you think about Brownsville in relation to Mexico City and Brownsville in relation to Winona Lake is actually twice as far from Brownsville as Mexico City. So his background, where he was raised and all of that gives him some special insight into this immigration issue. So that's who our panelists are. I'm looking forward to this. I hope you are too. And as you know, there'll be questions that you can text in. I believe the number will be up on the screen. Brent will filter those, and he's going to break into the conversation in a little while. And I have to stop talking. I'm going to pray real quick, and then we'll just let these folks sort of jump into the conversation however the Spirit leads. Father, we thank you for this opportunity. We thank you for your guidance, for your Holy Spirit. We thank you for guests that can join us. We pray that this would be a productive conversation. It would help us to think about things in new ways, bring up new ideas, and would really model a good, civil, sort of thoughtful conversation here this morning. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Hello.
I apologize. I'm from Texas, so apologies at the beginning here.
Do we want to just start out with some definitions to make sure we know what we're all talking about? We're on the same page?
Yeah, sort of lay the foundation.
Yeah.
So how many immigrants come to the country every year?
Do you know?
About 1 million.
Okay.
We have about 1 million. About 3/4 of those come here legally. Immigrants make up 15% of the population or so. We have more refugees in this country than any other country in the world, and half of the immigrants settle in one of 3 states. It's either Texas, New York, or California. Also, about 10% of all immigrants happen to be evangelical. So where should we go from there?
Well, let me just jump in. I'm a historian, and I think in terms of thinking about this debate, one of the most important things to try to sort of get out there initially is just to understand that this question or these questions that we're going to be addressing today around citizenship and around race and immigration have been around from the inception of this nation. The questions of how a nation defends itself, the borders that it makes. We have always been a deportation regime. We have always been a nation that is selectively kicking people out, blaming working class immigrants for whether we're in a depression in the 1930s and otherwise. But we have been a nation that has made some very strict immigration laws that have worked to exclude certain populations. Two things that I'll mention, and then I'll move on, open it up. But the first is the 1924 Immigration Act. 1924, by the way, is when La Migra is organized, or the Border Patrol, the U.S. Border Patrol, which is really, if you know anything about the lore or the history of the Texas Rangers, really sort of a reincarnation of that. That 1924 Act was about restriction, keeping more Eastern Europeans out, limiting the kinds of immigration and increasing more immigration from Western Europe and other more desirable places. That changes in 1965. Most of the time when we think about civil rights and civil rights politics, we talk about the Voting Rights Act, we talk about the Civil Rights Act, we talk about the Economic Opportunity Act in 1965 and 64. We forget that the Immigration Act of 1965 is the reason why the United States is the way it is today demographically in terms of Latin American immigration. It destroyed the national origin quotas that had been established, and it allowed for more immigration from Eastern Europe and from Latin America and Asia and Africa. And so those things I think are important to sort of keep track of, because people forget that 65 is really a pivotal year to sort of think about how it is that we get to the point that you just brought up.
So you use the phrase deportation regime. Can you explain what an alternative to that is, like how that's modeled elsewhere in somewhere that's not a deportation regime?
Well, I think nations have that history. I mean, I think we have a narrative. There's a story in this country that we welcome immigrants, that we want, give me your tired, your poor, and come to this nation. But at the same time, we also have a deportation. We also have a history of getting people out. And I think it's important to focus on our nation here because we see ourselves really as a beacon of democracy. We see ourselves, like you mentioned, more refugees, taking in more refugees than any other nation on earth. If we're going to do that, then we have to get our policy in line with our narrative. Because right now, there is a huge gap in that policy and that narrative.
And even building off of that, while I noted that we do bring in more refugees than anyone else, it's less than 1% of the total population in the country. So yes, we do appear to be a very generous country, but given the size and our capabilities, it tends to put it in a different context. Where do we want to go from here?
One thing that is in the narrative is the idea of a crisis at the border. And we can talk about what kind of crisis is that, but also can you guys help clarify, like, what makes it a crisis? Like, what is different now that's a crisis that wasn't going on before? Because I think that there's a lot of pictures that we see, there's things happening at the border and different sides telling us what's real and what's not about what's happening at the border, but I think it's unclear for a lot of us what's making it a crisis now.
So I'm going to just jump into that one. First of all, the crisis is a manufactured crisis. This is a crisis that has been manufactured by the Trump administration, and the biggest difference is in the separation of families and that particular policy. Remember, when I talk about a deportation regime, this is not just to say when Trump came into office, all of a sudden we've got this immigration crisis. We have lived in an immigration crisis from the inception of this nation. Whether or not we know that history or we've paid attention to it is something completely different. It's no coincidence that President Obama was termed or called the deporter-in-chief. His administration deported more people than any administration had prior. All Trump did is take it to a next level. So one example of that, in my hometown in Brownsville, Texas, If you are here seeking asylum, if you are here as a refugee because you are facing imminent danger in your home country, the United States affords you the opportunity to come into the country and wait in the United States at that particular office. What the Trump administration has done is said, you cannot wait on the US side, you must wait on the Mexican side, okay? That's created a crisis. That's created camps in the border town of Matamoros, right across the border from Brownsville, where people are having to wait there. So it's a manufactured crisis. I think we have all these sort of ideas of what the border is about and what it looks like. The border, and you might know the statistics better than I do, but the crime rates of border communities, they're relatively safe. Before what happened in El Paso, you followed the shooting of a white supremacist that targeted the Mexican population in El Paso. Before that happened, El Paso was one of the safest cities in the United States, right? Border communities are that way. And so this sort of narrative of crisis at the border is a manufactured one. I'm not saying there aren't any problems, but people live, we eat, we got great food, we've got great music. There's música tejana that we love to dance to in Texas, right? These are all part of that culture, and I think sometimes that news media shapes it in a narrative, takes it in a very different direction.
Yeah, and it's also the type of person who's trying to immigrate has changed. It used to be primarily men without their families, but that's changed, and there are lots of women with children now coming. So that's changed the complexion of it, and they tend to be coming primarily from the Northern Triangle. So we're talking Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. In the former two, they tend to be fleeing gang violence. And we see evidence of that because El Salvador has really cracked down on that. The homicide rates decreased, and now fewer people are leaving. So it's not as if people are coming just because they want to get to America. They're fleeing some problem. In Guatemala, it tends to be poverty. Now, poverty, we can't necessarily grant someone asylum simply based on poverty, but that can play into other things as well. Perhaps then there's oppression from the government because the country's poor. So that's where people are coming from, and they're coming with their families. And that has sort of changed the complexion. And there is, I know some people, when we talk about, is it a humanitarian crisis, is it a security crisis, there's a worry about gang violence. You know, if people are fleeing this gang violence, who's to say they're not also then trying to come into the United States? And it is true, people are arrested at the border for being members of gangs. But I think it's important to give the context for just how many people are arrested. And of all the members, and over dating the past 5-10 years, the percentage of people that are arrested at the border for being members of gangs make up 0.02% of those people that are arrested. So it's like 99.9% of all the people that are coming through that, and maybe they're arrested for lack of documentation, for not following proper procedure. But the people that are arrested are not gang members. Are there gang members coming in?
A lot of them are pastors, by the way.
Yes. So people are coming in, they are arrested, and we're finding a lot. I mean, there are gang members as part of this, but it's not the overwhelming majority.
Is there a narrative that, and I don't know if this is you might know as a former student of Grace College, like, is there a narrative that somehow immigrants are here to take our jobs, that somehow they're here to, it's what this president said when he launched his campaign, right? Mexico's not sending their best, they're rapists, they're this, they're that. And let me point out too that when he said that, that was an anti-Mexican sentiment, but you better believe Puerto Ricans, you better believe Cubanos, Cubanas, Salvadoreños, Salvadoreñas took that as a hit on their own. And I wonder, what's the context here? Like, what's the perception here?
I don't know what the Grace College narrative is, and I imagine you all have your own perspectives, and it's a complex narrative here. We disagree with each other, and we talk about it over lunch, and we talk about it in class. So I don't think that there's one Grace College narrative. But I also think that the more common narrative isn't immigrants are coming to take American jobs. It's more like a passive sentiment than that, that maybe as a result of immigration, there are fewer jobs for people that think of themselves as like an American citizen that didn't immigrate here. I don't think it's as much of an active narrative as the administration has made it.
Do you think that the demographics changing, and we sort of went into this a little bit on our phone call in preparation for this. But do you think that the fact that there are more brown people scares white people in Indiana?
Yes. But it's important to contextualize that because
I like that. Oh, yes.
because there's been some great work done on in-group and out-group threat. And people sort themselves into groups very quickly over the smallest things. And a very quick identifier is something like nationality, race, religion, etc. But as communities change demographically, whoever was in the majority can view that the people coming in as more of a threat. And it's not in those communities that were 50% Hispanic and then they became 55%. It's in those communities that were 5% and then they became 10%. It's those changes on the margins that seem to have the most dramatic effect on people, especially in areas of more segregation, where there's clearly the Hispanic part of town, for example. That's where you're going to feel the biggest threat. That's where it seems as if things are changing most rapidly. And there was a great experiment done to show just how people feel about these sorts of things in the lily-white suburbs of Boston. And it was people on a train going into work every day, and they changed the people on the train by putting in 2 people who were Hispanic to follow people in on their morning commute. Just looked like 2 people dressed ready for work, okay? That's all they did. These people didn't interact with the other people on the train. It was just another 2 guys waiting to go to work. They measured people's feelings about immigration before. They measured it after they introduced it, and people felt much more threatened. They felt like this higher level of anxiety. They were far more punitive in how they felt about immigration. They wanted more draconian policies. And this was with just 2 people sitting on the train car with them. So again, it was just having that slight change from being everything looked one way, and now it looks a little different. And people view that as a real threat.
So something that I take away from that is we have things among ourselves in our nation, in our college, to address about how we think and our biases and how we feel and about people, about individuals, but then also how that relates to how we think about issues. And you've talked about there's this manufactured crisis, like a lot of the crisis is in the narrative, but we also have a policy reform that we're all looking for. Like, I don't think anybody agrees that the system is just functioning really well and it's only in our narrative and in our media. So there's things for us to look at on a personal level, but how does where each of us is coming from, how do we think about reform? Like, what are things that can be done? Whether we think the Congress will accomplish them or not, what does good immigration policy look like for the United States?
Well, I think the first thing would be to actually have a policy. It appears to always be reactive. It's responding to whatever crisis is developing, whatever the newest problem is. But the United States doesn't have a goal for this is what our population should look like. We need to bring in X number of this kind of person, or we need to welcome this number of refugees. It's always just in reaction to it. So at no level has there been that sort of detailed conversation as to what's the purpose of our immigration policy. Is it just to bring in highly skilled immigrants? Is it just to bring them in and keep them here and try to discourage them from moving back home? Is it bringing in those sort of manual laborers and having them stay? Is it having them go back? We don't know. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's been such a source of conflict, because we're just reacting to whatever the latest problem is.
So I would completely agree, and I think to sort of shift gears from policy and kind of go into what I see as a teacher on my campus, we are a campus of 55,000 undergraduate students. 20% of those are Latinx or self-identify as Latinx. I don't know what the percentage of those are undocumented, but many of them are in my classes. If I were to answer your question in terms of what we need to do, the first thing is take care of these kids that were brought here through no fault of their own, that their parents that were fleeing or they were economic immigrants. Give these DACA recipients, these students these Deferred Action Childhood Arrival students, give them an opportunity to thrive, because they're some of my best students. They get to class on time, they do their work, and they're devastated, right? they're devastated. And so in terms of what you're going to do, in terms of how you're going to fix it, you have to, they're essentially the future of this nation. They're entrepreneurs, they're starting businesses. Go to the barrios here. Go to the neighborhoods around here. Raza starts businesses. We got taquerias, you got salons, people doing their hair, makeups, que las uñas, the nails, everything, right? I mean, all of that, when you do that, you take care of your future as a nation, right? And rather than demonizing these kids, rather than looking at them as somehow lawbreakers, give them an opportunity to thrive. And I think each one of us in here has that responsibility to go to our politicians, to our state representatives, and say, give these students, if we're not going to start anywhere else, if we're not going to have a policy, then let's at least do something for these students right here that are in desperate need. And the other thing is, stop separating families, right? Keep families together. It's a traumatic thing to separate a family, to remove a child from the arms of his or her mother, to move them away from where the parents are at, I think is a traumatic thing that stays with children forever. And I think, you know, I don't want to sound, you know, really bad here, but I think a lot of this is intentional. I think a lot of these policies are set up to traumatize these families, right? And to send a clear message to Latin America that you better not come here if you're looking, you know, for asylum, or if you're looking for some sort of economic opportunity. And as a nation, we fail. As a nation, we fail every single time we do that, because the history is that if you have a worker policy, if you let immigrants thrive, the economy is better, taxes get paid, right? People pay their taxes. There's opportunities for everyone, and I think we thrive as a nation. If we don't, if we set up these walls and all of that, then who are we as a country, right? Who are we as a nation if we don't believe in offering opportunity to people, right? Those are the two things that I would bring up.
Something that I studied when I was here at Grace my senior year was how, when consistently across a nation, but you really see it in the United States, when a nation is more economically comfortable, we are more accepting of immigrants. And in general, like people that are different than us. Like when I'm more economically comfortable, I'm just personally more accepting of people that are different from me. And we see that on a personal level and on a national level. And so you can look over American history, and in times of generally economic strength, we were more welcoming to immigrant populations, probably both in our policy and in the narrative. And then in times of economic crisis, you brought that up. In the Great Depression, suddenly there's all this, maybe not suddenly, but there's clearly all this blame that was being placed, and people that were categorized as an other and not in a majority were demonized. Looking at where we are now, do you think that that principle that we've seen throughout our history is still true? And like, where does that take us in the next 10, 20 years, do you think?
Well, even during the most recent Great Recession, we saw a dramatic decline in the number of immigrants coming from Mexico because the jobs weren't here, so they weren't coming for those jobs. But now the nature of why people are coming to the country is changing. So as long as we continue to have problems south of our border, and we're here as this beacon of light, I imagine we're still going to be attracting migrant families. And there are lots of people who suggest that one of the best things we can do to try to curb the number of people seeking asylum is to try to fix the problems in those other countries. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean calling for a coup. The United States does like to do that from time to time. But there are mechanisms at our disposal. There are economic resources that we have to try to shore up the failing states in the Northern Triangle. And there are people, at the federal level who want to do those sorts of things. So perhaps if we focus on that, then that can sort of change who's coming and why they're coming.
The policies that we've had over time that have excluded, for example, very, very intentionally, very directly Asian immigrants, at the same time that it opens the door to Mexican workers throughout much of the 20th century for points that you just brought up. The agricultural lobby, railroad is getting built, all of these things, that the nation is at a point of becoming a global superpower during the latter 19th and early 20th century. It needs labors and it needs workers. And so you have a system where Mexicans, especially latter, but around the first part of the 20th century, there's a revolution going on in Mexico. World War I is impacting the type of, the shortage of labor here in the United States. And so the floodgates are essentially open, even as we're restricting Asian immigration. That changes in the late 20s and in the early 1930s when the US government specifically goes after and targets Mexican, not only Mexican, but also German immigrants. But do you think it's deporting German immigrants, right? It's not. And then how can you tell who's a German on the street, right? Racially, people were able to identify, and this new formed office of the INS, the Immigration Naturalization Service, begins to identify Mexicans in terms of race. And so Francisco Valderrama has a great book called Decade of Betrayal where he talks about this. Of the 500,000 Mexicans that were deported during the Great Depression, 60% were US citizens, right? They were Mexican Americans, okay? So when we think about how these policies affect undocumented people, all Latinos and Latinas are at risk when we have these sort of draconian policies or when we have zero policies, because people get perceived that they're here either undocumented or that they're here because they're at Grace College or some other school because of affirmative action or some leg up, or they're here somehow breaking the rules. There's a great t-shirt that some people wear sometimes that I see. It says, "Relax, gringo, I'm legal," you know? Just to sort of get the fact that, hey, these policies affect everyone. That's why it's so important for all of us to be involved.
I think you said something that made me think about something that I struggle with is we want to be welcoming of people that are coming from a broken government in their nation or a culture that doesn't affirm their faith or their choices or whatever. And so we want to welcome them here because we believe that it can be a safer place for them here and a place where they can thrive. But then we also, as a country, especially under past administrations, tend to see ourselves as having a responsibility towards nations and towards helping them grow and becoming a place where their people can thrive. So how do you see, that's just something that I don't have an answer on and I wrestle with, and I think that probably a lot of you who are compassionate people probably also wrestle with about our responsibility there. And so I just want to know what you think about that because I wrestle with that.
No, you go, man, because I'm talking a lot.
Well, given that we haven't brought it up yet, I think it's important to talk also about how our faith should be informing these policies. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to try to go through the Old Testament and the New Testament and find in there, oh, so this is the number of immigrants we should allow into the country. But in countless passages, we are told to look after the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. And there can be tension between what the laws of a country may be and what we feel our faith may be calling us to do. So to help inform this, I was skimming through, as I'm sure everyone does every night, the writings of Thomas Aquinas. And he was, in the Summa, in question 105, he talks specifically about the Israelite policy governing immigration and what their rules should be. And he makes a distinction between those people that are just coming here temporarily and those that want to move here permanently. And then he goes on further to say, among those who move here permanently, those that are the most culturally similar to us are the ones that we should allow to stay. He says, the Egyptians, they can become citizens after the third generation. Those from Moab, not ever can they become a citizen. So some people may argue that culture and the cultures that are coming in should really shape our immigration policy. Perhaps we should try to encourage immigration from places that are more culturally similar to us. And I think that may be driving a lot of it is we see people that look different, we think that they are different, we don't want them to be here. But yeah, I think American culture is so much bigger than just where someone came from or what they look like. People think, well, the country is majority white, these people need to then be majority white. Well, then that means they're coming from Europe, and if we're just looking at an issue like religion, for example, it's a far more secular culture than anyone who's coming from South America. So if we're looking for someone who's more alike with our religious views, then we should probably be promoting more immigration south of our border. But we don't see that. We're not having that sort of conversation. And this answer is rambling, so I'm gonna back away.
I'll step in terms of the question of faith. Right now I'm teaching a sanctuary movement class at Texas A&M. And we're looking at the sanctuary movement in the 1980s when churches across this country and synagogues declared their spaces of worship sanctuary for refugees from Central America. It's a powerful movement. If you don't know anything about it, go and find out. There's really not much that has been written. There are journalistic accounts of it and so forth. But it was really on this question of people of faith from Tucson to LA to Chicago to New York to my hometown of Brownsville saying God's law in this regard supersedes man's law. And these are faith leaders that decided that they needed to break the law in order to help Central American refugees who were here seeking asylum. That if they were to be deported, they would be killed, right? And they took tremendous risks in order to do what they were going to do, but they really took to task a government that was not taking responsibility for taking care of people. That, mind you, it was responsible for creating that refugee crisis because it was funding much of the civil war in Central America, right? We have a responsibility as faith people to step up. You're going to break the law or not, but you better be having those discussions about what you're going to do because the Bible requires it.
And when you're having those sorts of thoughts, note that you don't have to do this alone when you're deciding, so what should I do if I feel as if my faith is in tension with what these laws are? These are not decisions you necessarily have to arrive to on your own. And that's why we're having these sorts of discussions. That's why you need to go to the people in your church, to go to your faith leaders, go to those within your community, because these are not easy questions to try to figure out.
All right, I'm going to jump in with some questions. Yes, the third voice in the room. I'm here. All right. All right, getting a ton of questions from all of you. Really grateful for you sending them in. I'm going to try to summarize some of them as best I can. There's a lot of questions coming in wanting to hear you discuss what a balanced approach is to the problems we're facing in taking care of our own citizens, people who are homeless, people who are not doing well financially here, even already in this country, and then trying to also care for immigrants that are coming, whether it's legally or illegally. So students are they're feeling tension and trying to have a balanced view there.
First of all, let me just say, we're not taking care of our people here, okay? We've got homeless veterans. We've got folks that are not getting what they need. There's a hunger problem on American college campuses, right, where universities are now having to set up food pantries, right, to help their students. College expenses are going through the roof. Families are more in debt. Student loan debt is out of control. We have a narrative that somehow if we help immigrants, that somehow then our people are going to be left behind. That train has passed, yo. We are not taking our responsibility to take care of our own citizens here, much less immigrants that are coming in. And the immigrants that are coming in, by the way, are not coming here because they're like, hey, it's beautiful in Indiana. The weather in Indiana, let's go move to Indiana because the sun is out year round. No, they're here to work, right? To start a business, to make a better life for their children, right? In those terms. And so I think we got to move beyond that particular question because we're not doing what we need to be doing.
Yeah. What I would add to that is it is hard to balance those priorities, and I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that if we were to say, let's close our border until we figured out all of our own stuff for our people, we would never figure out all of our own stuff for our people. We would find more problems and create more problems. So I don't think that there's one, like we just go to one side of the spectrum there and let that be the answer. And I also think that there's something about if we, like immigration can be part of what helps our country thrive and has historically been like what makes our country strong. And so if we have more diversity and more thought and more skills here, that might help us solve those problems in the long run. We don't know.
And it's true. There are so many competing policy priorities in the United States. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the government has to be responsible for every one of them. there's room here for civil society to chip in to help out, for churches to assist those that are immigrants, that are refugees. But it's also important to contextualize just how much money goes towards immigrants and then how much they give back. They historically take in far less in government benefits than they're paying back in all the taxes that they pay. So for many, it's a net positive. Yes, you do see money coming out, and it's harder to see the money that's coming back in because they're paying sales tax when they buy goods. They're sometimes they're paying income tax, or if they're here illegally using the wrong papers, they have a false Social Security number. They're still paying into Social Security, but they're never going to see it. So that's coming out of their paycheck too. So in lots of cases, they are paying more in. And they're also far less likely to consume benefits via going to jail or prison. Some people do worry about the criminal mentality among immigrants, but immigrants are far less likely than those that are native born to ever go to jail. So we don't have to worry about necessarily spending money on there. We spend far more money locking up our own people than we do any other immigrant.
If Trump has money to take from the Pentagon to build that wall, we got plenty of money, okay? There's plenty of money to take care of everybody. How about that?
All right, another question to throw your way. A lot of students are wanting to hear if you have practical steps from your opinion. Obviously, not looking for like the perfect answer here. What would you say is a practical step or two in helping to fix the immigration problems that we are seeing in the country? For the policies or procedures, what are a couple of practical steps from your perspective that you think would be helpful?
Real brief, vote. Get out and vote, number one. Number two, talk to your local representatives, send them letters, tell them that you want to see change, but get involved. This is a moment in American history where you have to get involved. You have to be active. The times of being on the sidelines are over. We're in a crisis in this nation. Our own democratic principles are being challenged, right, and pushed to the brink. Y'all have to get involved, and two easy ways and very practical ways are to get in touch with your local reps and vote.
Can I jump off of that? I was just going to say, I think that you were talking about how we don't have a comprehensive immigration policy, and we are talking about bipartisan, comprehensive immigration reform to fix our system, or to at least take our system in like the right next step. And our members of Congress aren't going to be able to do that unless they know that we want to see them working together. And so when you call them, I would say, just from my personal opinion, call them and say, I don't work with people on the other side. I just want to see this get better. Because everybody has good ideas, but we're not going to be able to share them if we're not talking to each other. And we need our members of Congress to do that.
And another thing I would urge is to go out to those communities that you don't know. Get to see people as people. Get to see what their problems are instead of what you think their problems might be. If you understand that these are people and these are people that are truly and deeply loved by God, I think that can really shape then how you want to approach any sort of policy prescription.
All right, a lot of students are I'm still receiving questions and texts about them wrestling through their faith that is telling them to be kind and to reach out to those who are in need, and also wanting to respect the laws, right, that law and order type of idea. So can you speak even a little bit more about how you wrestle with that personally, and thoughts you'd have for students?
I have thoughts. Y'all want to go and then I'll...
You guys must have asked a good question with that one. We don't have an immediate answer. I guess just on a personal level, I don't think that your knowledge of someone's legal status changes how you treat them, right? That's probably really obvious. But I don't think that your kindness and your respect and your curiosity into someone's story and what you can learn from them changes based on their background and where they came from. So I would just start there and learn about somebody's experience. And I think that in our faith, that is almost always the most important step, is to learn where someone's coming from, because we have so much hope for people, no matter what their background is. And you're not going to be able to share that with them in their context unless you know what their story is. So I would say, very simply, just like get to know people, get to know their stories, like what you were saying, and demonstrate just abundant respect, because they may not feel like they're getting that from larger institutions, but they can get it from you on a personal level.
So the one thing, the few things that I'll say that I think are critical in all of this in terms of how we think about our faith. I took a class when I was an undergrad. I went to a school very similar to Grace, and my favorite class was a class called the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know if there's a similar class here at Grace or not, but it was phenomenal. The entire semester on 3 chapters, right? And in there, I'll never forget when we were discussing very sort of heady topics around policy and government and social movements and what we need to do and so forth. The professor there said something that has stuck with me throughout my entire life. And he said, listen, and he was talking very personally about himself, but I've taken it on as a mantra of myself. I would rather err on the side of grace. I would rather be in the kingdom. I would rather be there and having God, say to me, you broke the law, but you erred on the side of grace. You were extending grace to another human being. If that's what I'm guilty of, I'm willing to go down for that. I'm willing to take the heat for that one, because I believe that that's what we're called to do. Rather than saying I'm going to be legalistic and I'm going to do this or do that, I would rather be mistaken on the side of grace. The other thing, I grew up in a church that was a sanctuary movement church in the 1980s. I was in junior high when I met people from all over Central America, and I was playing basketball with them. And I was a good Chicano kid. I didn't play soccer. They all played soccer. I was playing basketball. I would teach them basketball, and they would teach me soccer. I was just in junior high, but I think it's already been mentioned here by my co-panelists, that fundamentally transformed my life. And getting to know them and their stories and seeing them cry and their tears and trying to find their relatives in the United States, all of that made a deep impact in my life. But it did something also that it forced me, and I think this is part of the reason why I became a historian, is that it forced me to also look inside. What's my story? Who am I? Where do I fit in this narrative, right? And I think a lot of you all should do some of that work. I have a lot of white students in my classes where I talk about Latino identity, and a lot of my white students are lost. They don't know their story. They come to me, and they're like, I don't know what my immigration story is. Go out and learn that story, because when you know where you come from and what your story is, you're in a much better position to understand and learn from people who are different from you. And that goes for all of us.
So does that mean we should all run out and break every law we don't agree with? Which I imagine some of you are thinking, and I don't think that's the message.
You want me to answer that one, or are you gonna? Because I have an idea about that one too. All you got to do is go to the sanctuary movement. Anyway.
But I don't think that's entirely what we're trying to say. At least that's not how I'm interpreting it. And it's a struggle. And I think it's really important to get to learn why people are breaking the laws that they are breaking, their motivations for it, and to think about, what is justice, what is mercy, and how do those things interact. And reasonable people will arrive at very different conclusions. So I don't want it to sound as if we're just advocating law breaking either. I hope.
All
Are
right.
we doing that? Is that what we did?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing to this discussion on my end. My freshman year at Grace, there was a question asked in chapel that has stuck with me that I still wrestle with. So I just want to pose it to you, is do we love our neighbor across the street, or do we love our neighbor across the sea? And I don't think that that's really a dichotomy. I don't think that the answer is one or the other. But when it comes back to how do we balance taking care of the people that are already here in our nation and then welcoming immigrants, that's just a question that I wrestle with in a spiritual context of that question. So on a personal level, that's just something that I would encourage you to think about. But then on a policy level, I would say we have to look at all the good ideas and all the research and all the statistics and all this information and make decisions about what will allow our nation, our people, and other people to thrive. And that's a much more complicated conversation, but we have to wrestle with those day-to-day things.
And
Right.
if that means breaking the law sanctuary movement activists did it in the 1980s, and I think in certain aspects and in certain contexts, we're called to do that as well.
All right, I'm going to jump in. We need to end there. Again, remember, the point of these is to continue the conversation, okay? To continue the conversation. I hope that happens. Can we thank our people sitting at the round table? Thank you for being here. You're dismissed. Don't worry about scanning out. You're dismissed.